Hello, everyone, and welcome to this digital event. In the session that will follow, we are pleased to have some very inspiring guests who all worked on projects during these 3 years of research. But let me maybe start by briefly introducing myself to you. My name is Suyên Arts. I'm based in Belgium. I'm active in the media in Belgium, where I work for television, but I'm also fortunate to be able to travel from time to time to moderate panels, interview people, and present events. And obviously, the number of events that take place like a TV show are increasing because of this pandemic. I must say I was very happy to have been asked as a moderator for this final conference because the theme of inequality is a theme that is very close also to my heart. The negative effects of inequality and climate change on socioeconomic outcomes are mutually reinforcing and very difficult to disentangle. In the session that will follow, we will focus on projects that have studied not only the link between environmental change and inequality, but also how strategies to respond to climate change, such as agroecology, might affect income distribution. I'd like to let you know that we have the possibility via Slido to ask questions. So in case you have a question, don't forget to put it on Slido and they will reach me here in Brussels and we will make a selection of the questions to ask to our speakers. You can do this throughout the whole event. At any moment, we will take a look at your questions. But to open this conference, we will now first listen to Carlos Gradin. Mr. Gradin is a research fellow at the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, and he holds a PhD in economics from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. His main research interest is the study of poverty, inequality, and discrimination, especially in enhancing the empirical evidence as well as methodological tools for the measurement and understanding of all those issues. And given the complexity of the link between inequality and climate change, his insights on this topic are particularly valuable. So I am very happy to hand over to Carlos Gradin.
Thank you very much, Suyên, and thank you very much the organizers of the conference for giving me the opportunity to be part of this panel on the relationships between climate change, natural resources, and inequality, which I think is one of the most promising avenues of research on inequalities for the years to come. My plan here is just to give you a few reflections on what is the state of the literature right now and the situation that serve as a contextualization of the projects that are going to be presented later. I think that the introduction to this session is very important in pointing out that the relationship between climate change and inequality is complex. So we need to look at, for example, that there is a circular causality between these effects, like this diagram here shows, for example, that changes in temperature can produce changes in climate that at the same time have socioeconomic effects, changes in the patterns of development that can affect emissions that at the same time again affect temperatures, and the circle goes on and on. We need to take into account this circularity. We need to take into account that the negative effects when they are produced by inequality and climate change on different socioeconomic outcomes, they can reinforce each other. We need to take into account that if we look at the effects of climate change on inequality, for example, we need to pay attention to both angles. One is the direct effects of this climate change, for example, affecting the productivity of small farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, or in general, most disadvantaged groups. But we also need to take into account that the mitigating policies to fight climate change can also have effects, positive or negative, on this same population group. So we need to combine both the analysis of direct effects and the effects of policies. And I think that the projects that are going to be presented here provide these two angles of the analysis. If we look back in time, what happened with economic growth, income growth in this case, during the last decades. And here I'm going to introduce, I'm going to use data from a new database that we are going to launch in the next days, hopefully in Wider, in my institution in Helsinki, about global inequalities, so inequalities at the country level. So if we look at the economic growth that happened during the last decades, we can see that there was very strong and sustained economic growth. The economic recessions look very tiny when you look in the long term, but this growth has been really very unequal, in the sense that in the first decades there was much stronger economic growth in North America or European countries. Then later on, East Asia, mainly China, and even later South Asia, mainly India, started to grow faster. But there are different experiences with sub-Saharan African countries, for example, growing much slower. What was the impact of this on inequalities at the individual level? When we look at the whole population, or what we call global inequalities. Well, there has been some mixed evidence in the first decades after 1950, with in general inequality being quite stable or slightly increasing or declining if we pay more attention to the improvement of the bottom, the poorest people in the world. But we can see that a more clear pattern emerges in the last decade, that there is an important decline in inequality, no matter what index of inequality we use. In this graph, I'm presenting different indices with different sensitivities to different parts of the distribution. And we can say that inequality was declining with almost all of them. Only when we pay attention to the very, very poor, that is the index GE-1 shown here, we can see that in the last years, inequality started to increase. Some people don't like looking at these global measures, summary measures, and they prefer to look at the income share of specific population groups that sometimes highlight in a very simple way what was happening. And as you can see in this graph, in the red line, there was a large improvement in the income level of the bottom 40% in the last year. That is explaining this reduction in inequality that I mentioned before. At the same time, there was more stability at the beginning, then an increase during the 80s, and a decline after the 2000 for the top 10%. So this reduction in global inequalities was to a large extent driven by this improvement in the bottom 40% of the population, which mainly comes from Asian countries, China, and to a lesser extent, India. When it comes to looking at global inequalities, I think even that we are interested in inequality of everybody in the world, from an analytical point of view, it's useful to distinguish two types of inequalities between countries and within countries. First, because the country determines your living conditions to a very large extent. And second, because the impact of a specific phenomenon like globalization during the last decades or climate change, if that is what we are focusing here, can have different impacts on both components. No? The same forces that push the decline in inequality between countries because of this extraordinary increase in income in China can be at the same time explaining increases in inequality within several countries. No? And as you can see, in general, inequality within countries on average increase, or at least is highly persistent, much more persistent than inequalities between countries. So we need to distinguish at both. In this case, globalization could affect asymmetrically both terms. Probably climate change could change also that or not. No? It's that we need to analyze. I'm trying to change the slide. Oh, no. So, and this increasing inequality within countries in the last years is also quite different, quite heterogeneous. No? On average, there is an increase, but you can see that also it depends on the region that we are concerned with, the experience is different. For example, inequality in countries like in regions like East Asia or South Asia or North America, inequality tended to increase during the last decades. While, for example, in Latin America or in MENA countries on Sub-Saharan Africa, the general trend was to decline inequality within countries. So it depends on the area we are interested in. The context is different. So, but as I mentioned, I think we should try to distinguish the impact of climate change on global inequalities through these two different channels, between countries and within countries. The extent to which it affects the income growth patterns across countries, for example, if it works as a deterrent for sub-Saharan African countries to catch up with the rest of the economies, we will see an impact on inequality between countries. However, if it affects mostly the distribution within countries, like if they affect the ability of disadvantaged groups to make their living, like producing, if, for example, changes in the weather reduce the productivity of a small farmer, this affects the distribution within countries, and the same if it affects the capacity of countries to redistribute through taxes and benefits. And we also should pay attention to other dimensions different than income. Like it's important also impacts that may have on health environment, on education, etc. There is an emerging literature pointing at these issues. For example, in the case of between country inequality, we have here, I have here two examples of recent papers which highlight the negative impact of climate change on inequalities between countries, in the sense that the consequences of climate change are disproportionately hitting poorest countries. And the cost of greenhouse gas reductions also tend to have a major impact on these countries. And of course, we have to pay attention to what extent the mitigating climate change policy can also aggravate this, or they are in a smart way used to help to reduce this between country inequalities. In the second study, for example, they quantify the impact of global warming in the last decades on inequality between countries, in that inequality between countries is at 25% higher than it should be without global warming. That probably is one of the first studies looking at this, and maybe if this is confirmed by other studies, that means that it has potentially a very large impact on this type of inequality. And we are looking at the past, so we can only think that it will be worse in the future if there is no action taken to avoid that. In terms of inequality within countries, for example, this work by Islam and Winkel highlight the different mechanisms through which climate change can affect inequality within countries, mainly because disadvantaged groups are more exposed to the adverse effects of climate change, like, for example, weather changes that affect agriculture more than other activities. Also, when this damage happens, they tend to cause more damage to disadvantaged groups, and also the ability of these groups to cope with these effects or to recover from these shocks is also more limited. So ultimately, rich people can just leave the country, move to another country without and escape from those effects. So these are somehow the impacts that we should be concerned with. Also, more recently in the Human Development Report that has been recently launched, we can look also at some aspects of non-monetary effects of climate change, how it's affecting environmental health in particular. They find a strong association between countries having a higher human development index, that means higher income, education, and health condition. They also tend to have a healthier environment. And this imposes an asymmetry because at the same time, these countries with higher development indicators, they also are imposing a higher pressure on the planet through the material footprint. And this is the situation now, but the trend is also concerning because it tends to be aggravated. This is asymmetries over time. So just finally then, I think that we are going to have three very interesting studies. In one, they look at the impact of climate variability on social inequality in Vietnam. Also, we will see how changes in the climate can affect the environmental degradation, and this affects the fragility in the lower Mekong River Basin region, and also the angle from the mitigation policies. We can look at how one of these policies, agroecological intensification, can help to reduce inequalities in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing these presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos Gradin. I do have a question for you that reached us via Slido. Let me read it out for you. Diden's recent paper shows that between countries, inequality has decreased with COVID. Can you reflect on how the combined impact of the pandemic and of climate change could shape inequality in the near future?
Well, I think it's still too early to know exactly what the impact of COVID is going to be on inequality between countries, but I'm a bit pessimistic. I think it's going to exacerbate those inequalities. There are some projections that some people did in terms of that since the growth perspective of some poor countries is they are having a worse performance in terms of economic growth, that will tend to exacerbate inequality. But the impact can be mixed in the sense that inequality is something that it depends on where in the distribution you look at. It's different if you look at the most, also the poorest countries, or if you look at the world middle class, or if you look at the concentration of income among the richest, so the impact can be different. But so in the best scenario is that the impact is mixed, but I think everything points at probably a decline or an increase in inequalities between countries that could add on the top of other trends like climate change that could exacerbate these inequalities.
Okay. So what I hear is that you are, of course, we don't have figures yet, but you are more pessimistic in a way on what will happen on climate change and the effects of inequality due to this COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much, Mr. Gradin. It was very interesting to listen to you opening and setting the scene. So I'm now going to introduce our first speaker from one of the projects that will be presented today, and that is Grazia Pacillo from the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. She is a senior economist with more than 15 years of experience in research on food and agriculture system resilience, sustainability, and transformation, considering interconnected global and regional challenges, in premises, the climate security crisis. She will present us the main findings of the project on climate variability and inequalities, and this in Indonesia and Vietnam. We are completely ready for you, Ms. Pacillo.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I will be presenting this project that we have carried out in collaboration with the Mekong Delta Research Development Institute and with the World Bank as well. As you have correctly mentioned, we have carried out a comparative analysis covering the impact of weather conditions on inequality in Vietnam and Indonesia. Climate change and variability in Southeast Asia have been remarkable in the past 20 years. The German World, for example, estimates that half of Southeast Asia falls in the top 10 most affected areas by climate change and impacts for the past 20 years. And among these areas, Vietnam in the past years. For instance, in Vietnam, average surface temperatures have increased 1 degree over the last 40 years as well, warming even more. Between the end of 2015 and 2016, we observed that El Nino drought event has caused extensive impact on the income, especially of the poorer households. In the mountainous areas in the northern regions, we've observed an increased occurrence of devastating floods. And finally, even on the coastal area, we have 70% of the population that are really vulnerable, exposed to sea level rise and salinity. Similarly, in Indonesia, 40% of the population are facing high mortality risk due to multiple climate hazards such as tsunami, floods, landslides, you name it, drought, earthquakes, etc. So climate change has increased the occurrence of these events. Similarly, in these two countries, despite remarkable efforts in reducing poverty, we have a 10% to the 5.8% of poverty across Indonesia and Vietnam, respectively. We've observed an increase of inequality across the country, especially in Vietnam, for instance, inequality is widening even more in rural and remote areas, with the mostly populated by ethnic minorities. Whereas in Indonesia, what we have observed is that it has become the 6th country with the greatest wealth inequality in the world, with 4 richest people in the country having more wealth than 100 million poor people altogether. And this surge in inequality has been very localized. In Vietnam, for instance, we have increase in inequality, higher inequality, income inequality in northern mountainous areas, which are mostly populated by ethnic minorities and rural farming households, or in the central highlands, in those areas that effectively have been more affected by, for instance, the El Nino southern oscillation effects. Similarly, in Indonesia, we've seen an increased surge in inequality in Sulawesi, Kalimantan, and for those groups of the population that are most vulnerable to climate change, such as agriculture, farming households, rural households, or female, low-educated, and else. Great. So the impact of climate variability is bound to be non-negligible in the Southeast Asia. By the end of the 21st century, it is estimated that the region will lose about 11% of its GDP. But who is going to bear the burden of these impacts? Well, empirical evidence suggests that most of these impacts will fall on these sectors that are most reliant on climatic conditions, such as agriculture. But agriculture, we know, is the biggest source of income of the most poor, the poorest, or the most marginalized. For instance, Vietnam, 96% of the poor population derives its livelihood from agriculture. A similar situation we have in Indonesia. But other studies also suggest that agriculture is only one of the sectors that could be affected by climate variability, by the impacts of climate hazards. For instance, some studies suggest that because of the decrease of labor productivity and supply, the increase in temperature could also affect a non-farm wage employment as well. And on top of economic activities, of course, we also have other pathways whereby climate could impact on inequality and the climate, how climate could widen the gap between the richest and the poorest. And we've heard it. I mean, it could be remoteness, ethnicity, gender, other households and individual characteristics that could make people more exposed, more vulnerable, and less able to cope with the climate impacts. The self-reinforcing relationship of unequal relations of role, functions, decision rights, opportunities to access resources, etc., is often referred to as structural inequality. And the structural inequalities are the product of interaction of discrimination based on several individual characteristics such as gender, age, ethnicity, race, and religion. The combination and interaction between rising inequality, the existence of the structural barriers and structural inequality, and higher climate impacts and variability can create structural barriers, even bigger barriers, that limit disadvantaged people in their ability to cope with climate hazards. This is what we call the environmental climate inequality nexus in Vietnam, for Vietnam and Indonesia. So we skip this. This is particularly important for Vietnam and Indonesia because despite the implementation of certain policies to help the poorest and the most marginalized, the reality, the lack of voice and representation in the places of power have made this intervention less responsive to the real needs. So we need to really understand better the climate security and inequality nexus to help giving the voice to those that are most marginalized. But estimated the impact of climate on inequalities is not straightforward. The majority of most of the literature really focuses on the impact of poverty and considers inequality as a secondary and consequential issue. So we directly investigate the relationship. This is one of our contributions: the relationship between climate variability and inequality. And we do so also looking not at between country inequality, but within countries. So trying to unveil all the heterogeneity of the impacts across different regions, localities, but also across different groups, both in Indonesia and in Vietnam. As I was saying, estimating the impact of climate variability poses several challenges from a meteorological perspective. For instance, the lack of linearity of these relationships. So we can confidently assume that, for instance, an increase in 1 degree temperature around the mean values of the temperature distribution will not have the same impact of the same increase, 1 degree increase at the extreme end of the distribution. Also, certain temperature rainfall changes will not have the same impact if they happen in the dry season or the wet season, in the harvesting season or the planting season. So we need to take into account these heterogeneities of the impact on the climate side. What we do is we follow the Regina Young model in estimating and using the local random deviation of household income per capita and district commune level of Gini coefficient to estimate the marginal response of the change in weather. We control for the non-linearity of these impacts using different climate variables that are explained in the bottom part of this slide. But we also control for other factors. So one of the issues is that, of course, we have different impacts in different locations for different houses, as we explained before. So we control for that using location and household fixed effect. But we also control for other factors that could identify structural inequality. Usually, panel data are better suited for controlling for an unobserved households and location effects. And we have panel data for Indonesia, but we don't have it for Vietnam. But we control for these unobservables using fixed effect. Also, control for spatial autocorrelation across location, and within location autocorrelation using clustered standard errors, combined multidimensional cluster standard errors. So what are our results? Our study, the hypothesis that we wanted to test is whether the climate variability has a regressive impact on the population across these countries. So whether or not climate variability actually increases inequality in these countries. Our study confirms this hypothesis. Especially in the case of Indonesia, and for Vietnam, I will explain later with the nuances in Vietnam. And what we find is that not only climate variability increases income inequality, but also there are certain types of households, the quality of households that are bearing the burden of these impacts. And these households are the farming households, mostly the farming and rural households. However, we also find evidence that those households that also rely on non-farm wage employment are also negatively impacted by climate variability. So in a way, also confirming the findings of a previous literature, where they certainly include also non-farm activities in those sectors that will vary the impact of climate. But what are the results at the country level? So in Indonesia, our findings are mostly in line with the previous literature. Those studies that postulated a negative effect, contemporaneous effect of changing weather on income will be observed. In fact, we find that the highest effect on total income, reducing effect on total income, is at the extreme ends of the distribution of the temperature, so below the 18 degrees and above 30 degrees. Once again, agricultural households are the ones who are experiencing bigger, significant reduction of total income. We need exchange of the temperature in the current years. And the farm income, of course, is the one that reduces most systematically across entire estimations. Among groups, poor, low educated, and those households who rely mostly on agriculture for their livelihood are the ones who are mostly affected. But as I said, we also find some evidence that non-farm income households, rural and female-headed households are experiencing also reduction of income. Across season, we found an interesting result, which is that the age of the households seems to matter in the impact that the climate has on income. And this is specifically to say that older households are actually the ones that are the more reliant on farm and wage income in the short term seems to be better in a way in coping with the immediate contemporaneous effect of the climate hazards. In reality, there are several studies that are saying that older people are less able to cope and to adapt to climate change in the short, to climate variability in the short term. But there are other studies that are also saying that these households are the ones that are most likely to use remittances and transfers as an insurance during period of high climate variability. And this is what we find in our study. So in line with Young and Joy in 2007, essentially we see that older households are better to cope in the short term, but not in the long term because of the existence of remittances, these are remittances trusted. This is also something that we see in Vietnam. In fact, overall, what we see in Vietnam is that climate impacts are regressive, but in the first stage of our estimation, we find a positive effect of the impact of climate variability on the income. This is obviously unexpected result. It's not certainly in line with the previous lecture. But in fact, what we're missing there is again the role of remittances and transfers in the ability of these households to cope with the climate variability. In fact, in our second estimation, once we plug the variable of remittances and transfer, we want to control for the receipt of these short-term insurance mechanisms in a way, our impact, we find that the impact is negative when controlling for these factors. And in the rural, poor, ethnic minority, and young household heads are the ones that are bearing the most the highest burden of climate change. As I said, we also estimate the impact on the inequality measures of this Gini. This is pretty much in line with what I just said, with an increase of the Gini coefficient estimated at community district level, respectively for Vietnam and Indonesia, across especially the poorest, the rural, farming, low educated people for Vietnam, and then for the poorest and the elderly in Indonesia. So what are the main recommendation that we put together? So the rural transfers or remittances, especially for the elderly, seem to really work well in the short term, but it's not a sustainable strategy. So what we are recommending is that the government and the education organization foster and encourage adoption of longer term strategies such as climate smart practices, or the creation of some specific situations where elderly, low skilled, rural and households headed by women receive support in these moments, in these periods of high climate variability. In fact, even though the elderly population is small, this group of the population is the one that has the highest probability of falling into poverty because of the impacts of climate hazards. So the government should certainly adapt to conditional cash transfer to changes in climate conditions to ensure the participation of the elderly in these schemes. Similarly, ad hoc social protection schemes should be used to support women, especially in the rural area. We found that, of course, that women, especially in Sumatra, engaged in non-wage or in the informal sector type of employment that are receiving remittances and transfers are the ones that are actually vulnerable to climate change as well. In Vietnam, we find similar. We provide similar recommendation, but with the bigger change in terms of the structural inequality dimension to be addressed. So the first thing that we conversation also with the different stakeholders, we've noticed is that there is need to provide timely support to groups, the most vulnerable to climate hazard. The government should really aim to coordinate or create a real-time monitoring for these climate impacts that instead in Indonesia we have not found. It is quite a good climate system, climate service. Again, the use of transfer remittances is not sustainable, so we should really foster for look for longer-term strategies. But specifically for Vietnam, what we find is that agriculture is not the only sector that is vulnerable to climate variability. And in fact, the situation that the migrants, most of the migrants, they move to cities due to the very fast development of urbanization and the construction sector as well, are composed of both of the poorest and the marginalized people, mostly from ethnic minorities. And during this for example, during this time in the construction sector, they are effectively exposed to climatic conditions that are not as favorable as in other areas in other sectors. So providing enhanced social protection and formalizing the employment status of these migrants from especially from ethnic minorities will be important to enhance their capacity to cope with climate hazards. And in fact, what we are suggesting is that all the policies that are looking at the impact of the climate security and equality nexus to really address the overall, we have 3 specific recommendations that are related to, first, the need to monitor and effectively assess the impacts of the climate on inequalities. Second, social protection policies that are more targeted to the real needs of the people. And then finally, also strengthen the depth and the breadth of these protection policies in Indonesia and Vietnam, covering ethnic minorities, rural, female-headed households, and elderly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Pacillo. And what I heard is you have to indeed look at the short term in one side, but also really think about the long term. And I heard you also relate to what Mr. Gradin was saying in the beginning, that you have the countries amongst and against each other that might have difficulties, but also inside a country you have quite some differences very often. I have a question for you. Could you give some examples of climate smart technologies which have proved to be inequality reducing?
Absolutely. One of the things, the studies that we have carried out in our institute, in the Alliance of Biodiversity International and International Tropical Institute for Agriculture, is to look at the impact of, for instance, of salinity intrusion for rice farmers in Vietnam in the Mekong Delta. Mekong Delta is one of the most affected areas for the climate impacts, but also has experienced the highest surge in inequality. Most of this inequality is driven by differences in ethnic minorities, but also in the access to assets, resources, and opportunities by ethnic minorities, but also mostly related to the type of the sector, even within the agricultural activities. So the majority of these rice farmers, for instance, because of the salinity intrusion, they've been forced to move out of the sector, so engage in non-farm, migrate to the city, etc., and essentially leave their own family behind because of the salinity intrusion and the sea level rise in these areas. As part of our research, for instance, we develop rice-tolerant varieties that are tolerant to the increase in the salinity, and we create, for instance, barriers to stop the intrusion of the seawater in the farms. So these are just a few examples, but essentially anything that makes agriculture more sustainable in the long run, and in light of these climate impacts, could provide farmers with a more resilient and sustainable livelihood.
Okay, thank you so much. And of course, we will see you back in the panel discussion later when we heard all the speakers, as of course, all our speakers are staying with us, because at the end, we want to dive into a panel discussion. So really, don't hesitate to send your questions via Slido, and also all panelists. think about questions for each other, of course. But let me now introduce our second speaker. We will now listen to Linh Huynh. She's a researcher at IRD, the French National Research Institute for Sustainability Development in Hanoi and Vietnam. And she has worked on the fields of anthropology and sociology on land and water management, and her current expertise and interests lie on the linkage between environmental stressors and social equalities and justice, including aspects of climate adaptation and resilience. Mr. Huynh will talk about the project in the lower Mekong River Basin. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Susan, for your introductions, and hello, everyone. I'm speaking today on behalf of my research team, including Stéphane Ladré, Etienne Espans, and Alexis Courreau. And we have to say enormous thanks to the research team in 5 different countries, as well as the expert that had contributed a lot in our research throughout the way. So our research will focus on 4 lower Mekong countries plus Myanmar. So, as we all know about the changes have been happening in the regions. So it has been environmental change ranging from land grabbing to different issues of pollutions as well as different disasters. And climate change as well is actually entering the stream and exacerbate the issues. And then we see that different group of people affected differently. Like Mr. Carlos also mentioned, it's a vicious circle for certain groups like the poor and marginalized. So far, we do not have a holistic view on the literature in the regions. So that's why we enter this region as a systematic review. So we will explain a little bit why systematic review is different from the conventional review in the sense that we include in exhaustive search in several databases. We're using different tools and techniques actually to justify our selections of literatures as well as the screening process. So every step being justified, and we also search on scientific database as well as great literature. So critical appraisal also being built together with the expert groups. So experts from the regions, from 5 countries, as well as experts from the European countries also being concerned for their expertise to formulate our search equations as well as to formulate our screening critical criteria. So the process has been a little bit more than 1 year, starting in 2019. And we, of course, started with consulting different experts as well as formulating with the different research team. So in this presentation today, I will discuss with you the result of the systematic mapping, or we call scoping review. And the question we ask here is what is known from the existing literature about inequality, environmental changes nexus in the Mekong regions. So just walk a little bit about the methodology. So first of all, we talk about data collection. So we search on different database, but we formulated on a kind of equation, including some 4 factors. It called PECO, P populations. It means different group of people like the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, as well as ethnic group. And you, of course, here it's harder for you to see it, but you could always see the detail in our working paper currently published on the EU facility. The second factor is exposure. Here we're looking at different aspects of environment, including land, air, water, climate, ecosystem, and forest. And we have a different factor as well. It's called comparator, or Cs here. It's between different group of people. It's before or after an event or disaster. It's floods, storm, typhoons. Or it's the change or between locations, or even the comparison between countries. So in that way, we're actually seeing the inequality between. And the last one is the outcomes, which is the different aspect where the research have been looking at in the way that whether there is inequality inequality, or there is different economic impact, like the well-being, or sometimes it's more like displacement or resettlement of different group of peoples. So by setting out on the keyword, we actually making sure that our search is running into the direction of more exhaustive. So we're looking at inequality environment in two-way direction as well, two-way relation. So inequality actually affecting the environmental conservation in some way. And then environmental change actually affecting people in different ways, causing more inequality. So it's a summary of what we did. So in total, after more than 2 months, we gathered more than 18,000 literature, including the Ray one. And then after duplication check, we had about 14,500. And I just work a little bit fast in the way that after the title and abstract screening, we ended up with about 6,000 items to read in full text, and it took us a little bit longer time in that step. So after reading the full text and also to extract the data into an Excel file for analysis, we ended up with more than 2,000 items that being collected, and that would be used for further analysis in this presentation of systematic mapping. So in overview, we have articles, report, books, and then thesis and conference paper. It published between 1978 until 2020. And in that way, you could see that majority of our database are in journal article. I also need to mention, we also took a search in local languages publication as well. But due to the time constraints and human resource constraints, so somehow at the moment, we only store them as certain collections. And then there could be chance that we could look at them in the future. So by looking at the distribution of research between countries and also between periods of time, that we could see Thailand actually leading in terms of publication on the topics of environmental change and their impacts, actually showing the inequality aspect. And it's growing quite a lot since 2000. And it's the same, it follows with Vietnam and Cambodia and Myanmar. And somehow we found a lot less publications on the issue about Laos. And we could see that since 2000, the publication booming and the explanation were discussed with the expert, and somehow after the 10 years period of 1990s that we have a lot of publications about research and development. And at that moment, people starting talking about the impacts and the inequality aspect. And by looking at the keyword, we already see like 3 key aspects that pop out of our database. That is, the first one is about tenure and rights and conflict issues. And climate change actually also come out as that really important factor. And the last one is pollutions and exposure to different toxics and issues like pesticides and air pollutions. So if we look at those 3, so the land tenure and right and the access are actually the strongest representation in our database. It also gives us a chance to really look at that later for further analysis in terms of systematic review or narrative synthesis. So that would be the main reason. Like two next slide, you will see the main reason of our research. So the darker the color, meaning the more research on that relation being presented in our database. So we could see that ethnic group and Highlander or the poor or the farmers actually are being affected a lot by different environmental stressors. And the similar aspect as well is for disadvantaged peoples. And if we look at the impacts itself in terms of environmental change, there's a lot of research have been talking about livelihood insecurity and the well-being of people being affected. And linking to climate change, that we could see vulnerability issues or the health issues actually are being researched throughout. And when you see on those like really white color or lighter color in here, there we see the research gap that come to our conclusion and recommendations in terms of research gap, as well as policy recommendations. So we could see that from our work that research on environment that linked to different group of people like fisher, seafarer, migrant, refugee, gender issues, and some other non-traditional group are like SME or street vendor are being less presented and could be something that researchers in the future could look at. Urban and peri-urban poor are actually being less researched compared to the rural poor, because rural poor are somehow traditional target of research so far. So our main recommendation would ask research and policy discussions on the impacts of alternative strategy on environment and research governance that really needed. And it's to take into account the inequality that being embedded currently in the regions. And when look at the database, we see that inequality or different terms like injustice, inequity are actually a new terminologies, and somehow limited research being presented in our database. And direct discussions on those issues could really enhance the awareness and enhance to discuss the transformative strategy. So thank you very much for your attention. And please, if you have a chance to look at the working paper and the database that we put on the link on Zotero. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, and we will definitely take a look at the link that you are talking about. I got a question for you. Somebody is asking whether you also have taken a look at what policy might have been used in order to take into account the impact of climate change on inequality, and with what effect?
At the moment on our database, somehow we also have a corner that actually looking at different mitigation policies and climate change policy in the regions and how it affects the people. But somehow that corner of research also new recently, because mitigation policy or climate change policy is supposed to be for the positive reason, but somehow different group of people being affected differently. So that would be the in terms of that policy that we seeing that in the policy. But so far that would be a review, so that we hope that we could have some policy recommendations that sending up to policymaker and discuss it further.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mrs. Hin. I'd like to introduce us now to our last speaker, the third project, and that is Moussa Sall from Senegal. And he will give his presentation in French, but we have great interpreters, so that is not a problem. And I would also like to introduce him in French. Monsieur Sall travaille pour l'Institut sénégalais de recherche agricole et nous parlera du projet qui a visé à évaluer l'impact des incitations sur les inégalités de revenus en milieu rural et à les comparer avec d'autres types de politiques publiques. Monsieur Sall, je vous cède la parole avec beaucoup de plaisir. On vous écoute.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Je vous remercie de nous permettre de présenter notre étude. Si vous permettez, je n'arrive pas à déplacer la diapo. Est-ce que c'est à partir de vous et à partir de moi?
Vous dites, vous n'arrivez pas à bouger les slides, c'est ça?
Les slides, ouais.
Ok, bah, je vais demander à notre équipe technique de le faire pour vous. Donc, n'hésitez pas, Caroline, de partager les slides.
Oui, c'est bon, merci.
Ok, parfait. Allez-y.
Ok, donc c'est une étude qui provient d'une discussion tripartite, donc le CIRAD, l'AFD et l'ISRA, et qui était sur 18 mois avec les différents partenaires de l'ISRA, du CIRAD et de l'AFD. Je tiens à souligner que ce travail est un travail collégial qui a été fait
of the CIRAD, the AFD, and the ISRA. It is a work that we've carried out in cooperation with François Ferrard and Philippe Quillion of the AFD, and someone else of the other organization mentioned. And myself, Moussa Sall. So poverty is endemic in Senegal. It affects a large part of the population, 50% of the population, particularly in the rural areas. And there are important differences between 10 cents and €1 per day per person. There are some policies that exclude the poorest. For instance, if we think about subsidies for fertilizers, some people do not have access to these subsidies. So it's necessary to take into account the different situations of farmers in order to define efficient policies. So in Senegal, the groundnut basin concerns a large part of the rural population. It is the main region of agricultural production in the country, and it is particularly affected by the climate change, and it is combined to the deterioration of soils. So it means that the households are faced to major risks, particularly the poorest groups. So that's the reason why the groundnut basin is a particularly interesting area to study the impact of policies that promote agroecology. So we've decided to work with CIRAD and DFD in order to see what we could do in the field of agrobiology and how we could improve the recycling of nutrients and also better use the natural resources. So the main motivation is that we are trying to discuss the problems related to ecological intensification. We try to improve the content of nutrients in the soils, and we try also to take into account the diversity of the species, and we try to reduce the mechanical impact on the soils, and we also try to have a better coverage. But we also try to improve the management of the fertility of the soils, and we try to use the recycling of nutrients. So these are different points that we use in order to improve the quality of the soils. So what are the main questions that we raised? What are the policies to promote agroecology? What are the kind of impacts we want to have on the inequalities? What's the kind of production? What are the conditions, the costs, and the benefits? And we've used a methodology that is to first make an inventory of inequalities in the situation concerning the problems of food safety. And we've also tried to examine the economic situation of the different categories. So we've also worked on the basis of the database. It is the project for the agricultural support. We have 4,080 households that were covered in 42 departments of the basin. So as far as the results are concerned, first of all, we've gotten results concerning the inequalities. And the map you can see represents inequalities in the different departments concerned. So we have the ratio between the 20% of wealthiest households and the 40% of poorest households. So we have 75% of the incomes of the households that come from the agriculture. And we have, if we examine the median income, 35% more important in the case of men as compared to women. And when you have a dry year, as compared to a normal year, there is a decrease of 20% of the income of the household. So the message concerning this first part of my presentation is that we observe differences because there is a difference between the north and the south in terms of rainfall. And there is also the problem of access to land and the capability to work the land. There is also the incomes that people can obtain from other activities outside of the agricultural sector. So if we ask people if they have other incomes, we realize that with 450,000 CFA, for instance, they can really double their incomes as compared to people who do not work in other fields. So with the next slide, we're going to talk about the impact of public policies. So we have seen what are these public policies in favor of the agroecology. So we've tried to develop and stimulate the holdings. We've tried to use a growing model that is dynamic. It is called Celsius, a cereal and legume crop simulator under changing Sahelian environment. But you can see the details of all this in the document that is published.
Next slide, please. So to organize this modularization, we have started looking at the exploitations in the groundnut basin, and we've looked at the rainfall. And we identified 3 areas, 3 types of farms, type 1, type 2, type 3. The type 1 is the poorest, type 2 is the richest, and type 3 has average income. We'll come back to that. And when it comes to representativeness, type 1 can be found in the northern part of the basin, type 2 is in the middle, and type 3 is in the southern part of the basin. So you have less rainfall in the north and more rainfall in the south. In each area, the behavior of the type 1 category, so the poorest people, and type 2 are quite similar. But the type 3 was put aside in the analysis because these are farms with an extensive breeding system compared to farming. And so we should have used a more dynamic model in order to analyze these differences. And the model we used was better for the analysis of differences between type 1 and type 2 households. On this slide, you can see the presentation of the results per region, per area. So you can see the first region, which is in the center, Saloum in the north, and Louga in the south. And you can see the different characteristics of each area and of the different farms that we have analyzed. What you should remember is that the northern region is characterized by very high farm activities income. Next slide, please. Now, these are the 7 policies, the 7 public policies that we have identified through this simulation. First, we have the basic scenario where there is no public nor political intervention. So we'll just let the farm go on with their activities without any form of support. The second policy is related to the possibility of having an agroclimatic index-based insurance. The second policy is related to this insurance with 60% of subsidies. The next policy is related to the possibility of having a subsidy for a lending program with the possibility of getting a non-subsidized insurance. Next, with a loan program with the reduction of 90% of interest rate. The next policy is related to subsidies to mineral fertilizers and PK type with the possibility of having an agroclimatic insurance, but without subsidies. The next policy is related to subsidy to mineral fertilizers type NPK with a reduction in the prices of fertilizers by 50%. And finally, you have money transfers. And we've decided to look at the situation at national level, and we've looked at the households for which we have a maximum public expenditure of 150 euros. And we have decided to give 100,000 CFA francs. So that represents 150 euros. And that amount is cumulated and achieves almost 75 billion CFA francs, 113 million euros. And we've tried to be in line with the activities and the actions adopted by the state in order to assess the effect of this money transfer. Next slide, please. What are the main results that we have analyzed through this simulation? Let me tell you more about these results next to the impact on total income that you can see on this slide. We've also tried to analyze the impact on the volume produced, the impact on the agroecological surfaces, and the impact on inequalities. And we see that policies do not have the same effects according to the type of farm, but we haven't noticed a significant difference. So here you can see the impact on total income. And you can see the different references. You have the basic policy, and we can see that for the farms located in the center of the groundnut basin, the insurance and the subsidies for fertilizers are the solutions that enable us to have the strongest increase in total income for small farms. When it comes to the south of the basin, we see an efficiency for the program with interest rate and money transfer. There was no major impact in Luga for the type 2 households. And I suggest we now move on to the next slide. This next slide is now looking at it's not working. Next slide, please. Yes, sorry, we seem to have a technical problem. Yes, there seems to be a technical problem with Mr. Sal's PowerPoint presentation. But do you need the slides? Otherwise, we can go on while we are trying to solve the technical problem. Yes, let me go on. So the next slide was showing you the impact on the volumes produced. Here again, we realize that for the center of the groundnut basin and small farms, subsidies to fertilizers seem to be the most efficient policies, having a more significant impact on volumes. For larger farms, it's better to have subsidies related to the interest rate. Insurance and the subsidy to interest rate was quite interesting also for the euro area, and for Luga, the best solution is subsidy related to fertilizers, and that's where we had the most significant effect on the volumes produced. And in Luga type 2, we didn't really have a significant impact on this policy. Let's have a look at the impact on the services that are going through a transition towards agroecology. Here, the subsidies related to fertilizers were the most efficient for the north of the groundnut basin. In the south, it's better to have insurances and subsidies for small farms. And for the Luga area, the impact on these services are more significant with policies related to fertilizers, subsidies, and subsidies to fertilizers accompanied by an agricultural insurance. Now let's have a look at the impact on inequalities. We have noticed that policies are not increasing inequalities, but they benefit more to the poorest households. And we also realized that actually policies only reduce in a very limited way the inequalities. This impact is not very significant. And the amount that was used for the simulation, 100,000 CFA franc, is quite limited and so not sufficient in order to analyze the impact on inequalities. And I forgot to tell you that we were looking at the income of the poorest compared to the income of the richest. And there we can have results varying between 2 and 3.8. Now, what we should remember from this presentation is that poverty is actually widespread in the groundnut basin, more than inequalities. And the leverages to reduce poverty are increasing agricultural income through better access to production factors and through a better use of these production factors. And the impact of policies related to agroecological intensification is quite different according to the regions. In the north, intensifying cereal crops is not the best synergy and the best strategy because it would have a limited impact. So we need to support groundnut activities and other legume productions. In the center of the groundnut basin, where climate change can be felt the most, it is important to have insurance schemes and to face the risks, but not to the detriment of other policies. And in the south of the groundnut basin, intensification is possible. We need to promote subsidies for fertilizers while adding elements related to insurance schemes. So the policies to support farmers should be accompanied by policies to reduce the loss in nutrients. And we will remember that these policies tested are unable to increase the income for the poorest, fighting against inequalities. It allows us also to increase the production of cereals. Now, we need to remember that the organic resources that are available are quite limited, and this is an obstacle to the development of an intensive agriculture that would be in line with environmental concerns. So it is still difficult to get out of the trap of poverty for most farmers. And as a conclusion, we can say that we need to develop off-farm activities in order to have other job opportunities for these households. And this, accompanied by transfers, could enable us to achieve the objective, i.e. to fight against poverty. Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical problems in my presentation. No problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Sa.
Our discussant Stefano Signori, and he will tell us more on what is next and the time also to take a talk with all the people that have presented their project. So I'll see you in 5 minutes sharp.
From AFD, Agence Française de Développement, we want to tell you what the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities is, the projects we are carrying out, and our main research findings. The EU AFD Research Facility on Equalities is a programme funded by the European Commission and managed by AFD, aiming to improve knowledge and understanding of economic and social inequalities, their determinants and underlying mechanisms at different spatial levels, as well as the most effective policies and approaches to reduce them. With a budget of €4 million for the period 2017 to 2020 and a steering committee comprised of the European Commission, AFD and AECID, the Spanish cooperation, the programme launched more than 20 research projects in over 20 countries. This facility also aimed to engage in a joint reflection with member states on ways to strengthen the contribution of EU development cooperation to the fight against inequalities, in the framework of the implementation of Agenda 2030, and to contribute to EU development policy whose overarching objective is the eradication of poverty. The objectives of this facility are achieved through a three-pronged strategy. 1. Conducting research on the determinants and dynamics of economic and social inequalities in developing countries. 2. Targeting our work in partner countries that have expressed an interest or need. 3. Support partner countries and development institutions to integrate research findings into national policies and development cooperation strategies. Did you know that the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequality has produced over 100 research papers and policy briefs? All these articles analyse the links between inequalities and a wide array of topics such as education, health, labour markets, housing, taxation and climate change. These research publications, the support to the structuring and the strengthening of research networks on the topic of inequalities, further supports policymakers and development in mainstreaming and tackling the reduction of inequalities in their policies and strategies. However, the main point we would like to share with you is that we have observed how generalised are the effects of inequalities for societies, how unequal access to public services lowers the willingness to pay taxes, how unequal access to stable jobs creates poverty traps and exclusion, and how inequality shapes perceptions and the willingness to cooperate. So, how can we help strategies to reduce inequality? Through the development of new tools such as the inequality diagnostics, and the expansion of existing tools such as the fiscal incidence analysis and the multidimensional inequality framework, the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities supported the governments in partner countries and the civil society in building evidence-based strategies to reduce inequality. All these results have been presented at conferences, such as the 2018 International Conference on Inequalities and Social Cohesion, in national workshops and stakeholders events, such as those organised in Bolivia, Mexico, Tunisia and South Africa, in a series of webinars organised in 2020, and of course, in this final conference. In this final conference, beyond the presentation of all the results of the facility, there will be an opportunity to launch a second phase of reflections and partnerships that will be articulated in the extension of the facility over the period 2021 to 2026. We will be supporting 4 countries, Colombia, Indonesia, Mexico and South Africa, to design and implement policies to reduce inequalities. Will you join our goal to reduce these inequalities? Help us share the knowledge on reducing inequalities.
Welcome back to all of you. As said, just before the break, we will now listen to Stefano Signori. Mr. Signori is a qualified lawyer and he joined the European Commission in 2000 already. Currently, he leads the thematic work on sustainable energy, climate change and nuclear safety. So I think he is our ideal last guest of the morning to talk about what's next. So please, the stage is your Mr. Signore.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for these informative presentations and for the invitation to participate in this discussion. As we know, growing inequalities are leading to a backlash against globalization and are contributing to political instability across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic and its health and socioeconomic consequences are worsening deeply rooted inequalities, disproportionately affecting persons in vulnerable situations, as we have seen, making it harder to leave no one behind. The proportion of the world population suffering from extreme poverty rose in 2020 for the first time since 1998, and up to 150 million people fall back into extreme poverty. As we know, rising inequalities are a global phenomenon, making it important to build international partnership to address these challenges in a joint and aligned manner. On this way, I would like to underline the need for data analysis, collection and management, and the relevance of the work carried out under the EU AFD research facilities on inequalities. The design of public policies addressing climate change and inequalities has to be based on robust data, including on the effectiveness of measures. This is key to support effective development planning and implementation. The results presented today confirm the impact of climate change on inequalities and draw our attention on the complexity of the phenomenon. Such targeted analysis is needed to help policymakers take into account the specificities of each situation. As shown, for example, in the first presentation, in Vietnam, rural and ethnic minority households bear the biggest burden of climate variability. In Indonesia, the most affected groups are poor households living in rural areas, in particular older households and those headed by women. The findings also confirm what IPCC report stated already in 2014, that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. Climate change and environmental degradation affects poorer countries and poorer communities across the world in the first place. The three studies that have just been presented confirm also the following findings. First of all, that countries in tropical and arid zones, where the most developing and emerging countries are located, are expected to face significantly higher exposure to extreme weather hazard than developed countries in temperate zones. Second, that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. They represent, for instance, 80% of people displaced by natural disasters due to extreme events. And once displaced, they become more vulnerable to gender-based violence and human trafficking. Third, that indigenous groups who depend on natural resources for their livings are vulnerable to losing their livelihoods as traditional hunting, foraging, and farming methods become less reliable as climates and ecosystem change. However, beyond studying the extent to which climate change increases inequalities, we have also to study how increasing inequalities can undermine climate action. High level of inequality represent an obstacle to sustainable development, which can lead to weakening community resilience and country stability, making the climate crisis much harder to tackle and ultimately causing further environmental damage, waste, pollution, increased environmental crime, and also social insecurity and unrest. It is the reason why, as you know, the Commissioner Urpilainen has decided to set fighting inequalities by building inclusive and sustainable society as the overarching political objective of our efforts in the area of international partnerships. This is fully in line with the priorities of the European Green Deal and the Green Recovery Agenda, which should be green, digital, just, and resilient, as our President von der Leyen said. This is a recognition that a successful low-carbon transition depends on social, economic, and environmental inclusion. This is the essence of the notion of just transition. While the process of transforming economies to become more climate-friendly offers opportunities to make economies more inclusive and resilient, on the other hand, the poorest and most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change should not pay the highest price from the policies that aim to address climate change. It is here that researches such as the one conducted on the condition for implementing support for inclusive agroecology in Senegal are particularly relevant. They illustrate the need to understand and take into account the complex mechanisms underlying inequalities, farm sites, condition for access to land, gender inequalities, location, in order to conduct public policies in agroecology that respond to both climatic and inclusive development challenges. Therefore, the question here is how we can ensure that the green transition also serves as a tool to move towards a just and sustainable transition for all, and further support our partner countries in reducing social and economic inequalities. This is not automatic, as we have seen, in terms of the correlation between income and, for instance, carbon emissions. I think there is one element that has not been sufficiently discussed in the public debate so far, and it is the rise of the middle class, the global middle class. If indeed it is well noted that those in the top 10% of income and the bottom 50% are responsible for inversely disproportionate carbon emission level, respectively 49% for the 10% and only 7% for the bottom 50% respectively, it is more rarely said that the global middle class, the 40% of world population, was responsible for 44% of the global emission in 2015 and for almost 50% of the increase. The global middle class earning between $10 and $100 per day per capita more than doubled from around 1.8 billion in 2009 to 4 billion today, and is projected to grow to 5.3 billion in 2030. More than half live in Asia, and 88% of the next 1 billion will also live in China, India, or another Asian country. With 5 people emerging into the global middle class every second, the question is if a growing urbanized middle class is compatible with the 2 degrees pathway. Some worry that without effective mitigation policies and strong change in behaviors, a fast-growing middle class could drive the world off an emission cliff. Therefore, the role of the cities. The cities offer unique entry points for partnership and to support administrators, mayors in new middle-class metropolis. The support should include aggressive low-carbon urban planning, energy-efficient building, mass transport system relying on e-mobility, as well as green energy solution. The research presented on inequalities and environmental changes in the lower Mekong River Basin also illustrate very well the rise of inequalities through anthropogenic environmental degradation in the region, including the construction of dams, over-extraction of underground water, pollution from fast developing cities, deforestation, sand extraction, etc. But also show the need to address and mitigate the risk of any accelerated rural transition and its impact on the economy, employment, and rural to urban migration trends. A green growth that creates jobs and tackle inequalities remain a political challenge, requesting new policies and technologies to prioritize those who are more in need. Among the new policies expected to develop in the coming years, I would like to highlight the phasing out of environmental harmful subsidies. The absolute value of fossil fuel subsidies, nobody knows exactly. Only for consumption, it is estimated at around $400 billion per year. The fiscal burden imposed by subsidies means fewer resources are available to fund alternative approaches, such as renewable energy technologies. But subsidies also absorb a lot of money, and the money could be used to support the poor in a better targeted way, also because those subsidies are in general regressive. Current lower fossil fuel prices mean that countries have a unique opportunity to remove subsidies for fossil fuels and or to raise taxes on high emission fuels without major additional impacts on, on the end consumer. This could lower the risk of negative distributional effects and social unrest, which frequently blocks a reform. Let me conclude with the reference to the notion of carbon inequality, which is, in my view, interesting to keep in mind when it comes to the inequality climate nexus. Carbon inequality designates basically the unequal starting point of the world's richest and poorest in accessing the remaining atmospheric carbon budget to improve living standards and lowering vulnerability to climate impacts. It's not a black and white, and this is a complex notion. If high-income population contribute most to cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, they also have greatest capacity to invest in mitigation, option to limit climate risk exposure and adaptation. And the richest 10% live in every continent. The poorest population contribute the least to emissions and suffer disproportionately from climate change impacts, as we know. An equitable distribution of resources to tackle climate change now needs to include the rich wherever they reside, prioritizing the use of the remaining carbon budget for those who deserve it the most. Efforts are urgently required if we are to avoid the most dramatic consequences of climate change, and I'm sure that the work done and presented today goes in the right direction. It will help partner countries to show their highest possible ambition in their new updated climate plans and to scale up action to ensure they actually meet their climate target. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Signore, and I completely agree with you that we have seen some great work from all the people that have been presenting, and they are all still with us. So welcome back, Ms. Pacillo, Ms. Hun, Mr. Sall, and Mr. Gradin. And we do have some questions, but I'm first of all very curious whether some of you might have a question for one another. So feel free to raise your hand and then I'll give you the floor to ask the question. Let me see if anybody would like to say something. Mr. Gradin, yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Sujin. No, I just was wondering with Grazia's presentation that was very interesting. And I think she highlighted something that probably I omitted in my presentation, that is the issue about group inequalities, no? That also Stefano mentioned. And I think it's a very important dimension of this impact that climate change can have on inequality. In particular, in the case of Vietnam, for example, exacerbating initial inequalities that exist between ethnic groups, no? And also by gender, of course. And I think that's something that we should pay attention. And I was wondering somehow to what extent in this particular case that could also exacerbate conflict among these different ethnic groups and lack of trust between these ethnic minorities in the majority of the country that probably already exists, given that they are minorized. No? So if you have any thoughts, probably it goes beyond your study, I understand, but if you have any thoughts about what could be the impact in this sense. Thank you.
Very good question. And yes, let's listen to the response of Ms. Pacillo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carlos, for this great question. In fact, it's pretty much related to this question, and I wanted to pose also for Lynn. As part of our climate security research area, in fact, it occurred also after this work that we've done in Vietnam. We are trying to understand linkages between climate security and inequality and all the way to grievances and conflict. And one of the studies we have just recently launched the research, well, not recently, a couple of years ago, the CGIAR focused on climate security. You can also check out our website, a little bit of promotion here. But we've also recently launched a PhD program with Wageningen University and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute to exactly investigate what we were talking about for Vietnam. For the Bangladeshi Delta and also for the Sahel region. And specifically for Vietnam, we just started the analysis linking essentially the impact of climate on inequality all the way to human security and social security as well. And what we are starting to see is that despite the fact that in Vietnam we don't have officially recognized data and evidence of the occurrence of conflicts and tensions. I mean, if you see on ACLED data, for instance, on Uppsala data, you see that there's only like 3 or 4 events, for instance, in the Mekong Delta in last year. So it's a relatively very, very stable and peaceful environment. There are issues related to the access to water, for instance, water security in the Mekong Delta that needs to be taken into consideration. And of course, we know that, for instance, the migrants that are mostly ethnic minorities or people that are most vulnerable, that are forced essentially to migrate from areas that are even more exposed to climate hazard to other areas that are certainly more stable. In Vietnam, they don't have a right, and Linh can confirm that, they don't have a right whenever they move in the new location regarding to access to resources, not even to access basic services such as health, education, etc. So they don't have voice and participation in the places where they migrate to. And if this is spurred and exacerbated by climate, of course, here we have a problem of representation and issues. However, specifically with conflict, so what do we know about this relationship is that climate doesn't, the literature says the climate doesn't directly impact on conflict and human security. What it does is it exacerbates existing risks and insecurities. One of these is, of course, inequality, especially when in presence of structural inequalities such as the ones related to ethnicity, gender, education, and as linked and limited by the political representation, we would expect an important impact on security in the country. Of course, there are mitigating factors such as institutional political setups, etc. But of course, we would expect that there will be an increase in grievances, tensions, specifically at community level. And in fact, we've carried out a similar sort of analysis for Ethiopia. And for the Central American Dry Corridor, and for the project together with the CIPRI, with Stockholm International Research Peace Institute, and the WFP, so the World Food Program. And what we find is indeed that climate is exacerbating existing risks and threats that actually increase the risk of conflict in these countries.
Thank you. And did you say, Ms. Pacillo, that you also had a question for Ms. Hun?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Yes, it's related still to climate security and the link between climate and conflict. We all know that the Southeast Asia is considered sort of like a peace heaven in either way, despite the recent events that, of course, we all know about. But the Asian peace seems to be the trend across many countries in Southeast Asia. But I was pleasantly surprised, or not unpleasantly surprised, but of course, because it's in line with the research that we are doing, that from the systematic review that you've done, you found a significant correlation or network relationship between climate and conflict. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on where you found such connection and to what extent, what are the intermediate factors that you could have identified between conflict and climate that could explain this relationship?
Thanks a lot. Actually, our database showing the correlation with what you just mentioned, that climate change actually not causing direct conflict, but more like exacerbate the conflict or somehow create more problem to those people that under into the disadvantaged situation. So conflict in our database showing a lot. In the case of land issues, like land grabbing is a big issue in the region. So somehow different investments coming to the region creating land conflicts. It conflict between the local community, especially the ethnic group in the mountainous area of Thailand, of Myanmar is a recent population saw it. And it's also conflict between different ethnic groups of different communities because the land resources being less available. And some other parts also, the other discussion we had with Jean-Christophe Diapart, is he the expert in Cambodia, he said there is an ongoing movement of lowlander to the highlanders. And in that part, lowlander is facing problems, or we could call inequality in the lowlands. So they find a way to mitigate that by moving to the highland, and in some way causing some conflict between them. So different issue creating conflict in the region. So those are just some really dominant aspects. And then climate change, when it happens, so any change in the climate exacerbate that issues. So that would be the data that we have seen. But then the direct conflict caused by the climate change is not represented in our data.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Hun. We had a question, Mr. Sall, for you, Monsieur Sall. Est-ce que je peux vous poser une question? I think there is a problem with. Il y avait une question qui était adressée.
No, for you, Mr. Sall. It is a question that we found in the Slido. So in fact, you talked about the groundnut basin, and someone was wondering whether the results that you obtained in the framework of your study are results that could be used for other basin regions in Africa, or not at all. Well, thank you very much. Well, the groundnut basis is a bit specific to Senegal, and you find some features there, such as the rotation of crops between the millet and nuts. So in the other agroecologic areas, with the exception of the north of Senegal and also the other Nang region, so otherwise I think it would be possible to extrapolate that to other areas. But what I could say is that in some regions it could be used. We use, in fact, the groundnut basin because it is a very important agricultural area. And we have the same system in the other agroecological regions. But I cannot give an answer outside of Senegal because we have other features as compared to other countries, for instance. I'm going to add another question that we've just received. So you talked about subsidies to the NPK. And so the question is, it seems not to be very good for the environment. So what's your reaction to this? Well, I agree in part with the person who raised that question. So that's the reason why we thought we should change the paradigm today, because today the government give subsidies for mineral fertilizers and for seeds. So we try to change the paradigm by saying that all this money that they give to for these mineral fertilizers could be used, for instance, in other agroecological systems where we focus on organic possibilities to try to have a richer soil, because the problem is that the agricultural system that we have has exhausted the soils. So it means that the young people cannot identify with the agricultural system. So the main problem we have is that there is a migration towards urban areas because the young people do not want to continue working in the agricultural sector. And in order to interest them, we have to try to demonstrate that there are possibilities to work and take into account the environment, to show them that it is possible to generate incomes and also to work with a perspective of sustainability. So when we talk about ecological transition, in fact, we want to demonstrate that some policies can be developed that are going to allow people to stay in the agricultural sector. Well, thank you very much.
Following the translation. So basically, it is not so easy to see in what's happening in one country, in Senegal, in the peanut business, to take it to other countries, because it's something quite specific. And Mr. Sall was also saying that a lot of young people are not interested any longer to work on the territory. So we need to get them motivated with certain things that would help them to stay in the country and not spread out there. I have another question because Mr. Signori was talking about the Green Deal, and I wonder, Mr. Gradin, would you think that working on the Green Deal will indeed help us also to reduce the inequalities that we have in the world?
Yeah, well, definitely. So I think we should look at this situation as also the opportunity to change the pattern of growth that we had during the last decades. And that will help both to improve development or to look for ways to improve development while at the same time improving the environment. And the case probably mentioned for Senegal of agriculture, of agroecology, probably is one example in which probably you can combine improvement in the environment with improvement in the development of less developed areas. No? And also, for example, I would say that the environmental issues create the possibility to extract incomes, for example, from those that are producing more pollution. No? And you can use those incomes also to transfer and create incentives for the poorest people to, at the same time, improve their living conditions and changing the patterns that maybe are produce more pollution, for example, in terms of the energy they use. So it creates at the same time the possibilities for new development. So they can be aligned, you know, a more sustainable development with improvement in the environment. But of course, that needs a lot of coordination between different administrations. That needs some kind of consensus. That probably is also something that should be explored. You know, to what extent these affected populations, they are really aware or not about these challenges that we are facing and whether they come from. And we need somehow the public opinion in different countries being accepting the challenges that we need, and that will go through changing our taxes, changing our benefits, changing our ways of using energy, etc.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I think, Mr. Signori, you would like to add something on that?
Yes, indeed. This is, let's say, a complex issue even in the European countries. So you can guess how complex it is in our partner countries. But I will give an example. Take a country like Nigeria, $2 billion per year in fossil fuel subsidies. So you can do a lot of things with $2 billion per year by targeting this money to the poorest households, you know, cash transfer, social protection, education. Of course, the fact is that these are very popular subsidies, so it's not easy to phase out or to put in question. We have seen in Nigeria, we see in Ecuador, many times even the poor are in the street to try to defend the subsidies that most of the time are regressive, that they benefit more the middle class and the rich. Because if I have a car or a truck, I will benefit from the subsidy. If I don't, I will not benefit. So what I want to say is that these policies are complex to manage, require a lot of leadership, require, let's say, sophisticated policy mix. And of course, we are ready to help. But in the end, it is, let's say, of course, government responsibility to try to accompany this and try to make it sure that, as it has been said by Carlos, let's say, to extract the money from the richest to channel to the more vulnerable part of the society. But it's not easy. Over.
Yeah, indeed. It is something that is not easy. And what I hear you say is that sometimes you have the poor that are defending actually the money that will not go to them, that will go to middle class or to richer people. I really wonder whether you ladies have something to add on that, because you are working very specifically in Asia. Is there things that you can share with us based upon what the Green Deal and the fact that we work on making a sustainable world also an opportunity to think about inequality and to try to see an opportunity there? Yeah, Ms. Hin?
Yeah, just to add in that, because actually with our research on the programs, we discuss about the policies and whether, like Dr. Cretton already mentions about business as usual probably is not the good way anymore. But somehow when it comes to policy actions, and then you could see we call developing countries, it means at the moment the focus and also the dominance ideas about that is actually about growing. And in that way, you could see investment coming to Myanmar causing different problems, but it's still a dominant way is still going. So we actually discussed that with some different research institutions, as well as some, like if you heard about Mekong River Commissions as well, we discussed with their expert. And then they said they have been doing those consultancy and advocacy work about how policy should focus more on environment and also on different group of people that being disadvantaged, but it's still a complex issues. And different policies on poverty alleviations and actually targeting different groups like the poor in the urban that I could say in Ho Chi Minh City, but somehow probably talking about top-down policies with lack of participations. There are discussions on that in Vietnam, but until it being implemented in different resettlement policy, in different projects actually linking to mitigation policy linking to climate change, to clear out the canal in the way that reduce pollutions and also create more green space in Ho Chi Minh, but actually resettling a different group of people to a different way, especially the migrant from the rural area. So just one example. So actually no more like transformative things is going on, but the discussion is there. But I know that I also know UNCRIS is currently working on that transformative idea with Indonesia and Vietnam. So I hope that we could continue with research linking to policy dialogue.
Yeah, indeed, it's interesting to link everything together. And maybe let me ask you a question, and I suppose that the others will also have. Somebody asked about the impact of policies. They depend on regions and on the group really targeted. Would you recommend such policies to be decentralized to fit the local population's need? Or would you rather say, make it centralized so it can be seen as a mean for equality between the territories? I don't know whether you have something to add, Ms. Huynh, or maybe Ms. Pachiro?
Maybe just a really quick from my side.
Yes.
We worked in development project before, and we realized that, yes, we're talking about participation from the local communities. And in that way, decentralized probably could actually work, but in some way with the current and also with the history of forming as a state governance, somehow a top-down approach also being added. So finding the balance between those could actually the way. That would be from the perspectives, actually specifically on Vietnam. I could hardly say that for the different other countries in the Mekong.
Okay, Ms. Pachilo, yes, please.
Thanks, thank you, Lynn. I'm pretty much in line with what Lynn said in the sense that, of course, decentralization, especially when we look at the evidence that is rising about the impact of on inequality and the fact that some groups are disproportionately bearing the impact of these climate hazards. So definitely listening and giving voice and participation to at the lowest level possible is necessary. So definitely for the decentralization, especially in the context of Vietnam. But I also wanted to reply to the issue of the question about the Green Deal or other big movements and big financial investments, such as the Green Climate Funds, etc., etc. What is fundamental is that these are all very great investments with really great ambitions to tackle the impacts of climate on certain aspects. What all of these investments are actually lacking of is the next step. So we know, for instance, that these climate funds and investments are actually going to reduce and mitigate the impact for climate on several aspects, be it agricultural productivity or food security, etc. But do we know about the longer term, not the longer term impact, so the next step of these impacts? When we introduce a huge amount of money and on certain sectors such as agriculture or other related to climate, what are the balances of power that we are actually changing, even at community level? So, for instance, if we give to the rice farmers in the Mekong Delta that are subjected, affected by the Italian intrusion, the possibility to change a shift to the shrimp farming because of all of the issues related to the rice farming, etc. And we give this opportunity only to a specific group of farmers, maybe the majority in the ethnicity groups, etc. What are the implications for other groups, and how is the balance of power between these groups actually going to change? So what I'm trying to say is that we live in a world which is affected by the increasing climatic crisis. What we are missing oftentimes in investments, especially at the international level, is the clear understanding of the fact that we need a systemic view. We need to embrace the complexity on the fact that the ecological systems, which is affected by the climatic crisis, interact effectively with the socio-economic systems, which is then related and very much linked with the socio-political security system. So we have different systems playing and giving feedback loop essentially with each other, whereby climate insecurities can, in fact, be mitigated by some action, but this action can also have effects and impacts on the different insecurities that could lead to more grievances, tensions, human insecurity issues, and so on and so forth. So acknowledging the link, the fact that we're not going to stop at the mitigation effect on agriculture, on poverty, on food security, but we need to go to a step further, looking at the human security as a whole. I think that would really give the opportunity to these financial investments to step up and to create a more stable and peaceful environment.
Thank you. Human security, very nice words you use, Ms. Bacillo. And we are almost at the time that we have to wrap up. But what about turning roles? And we had Mr. Gradin that opened the conference, and we had Mr. Signori that closed everything. So let me give first a last word to Mr. Signori, and then I'd like to end with Mr. Gradin to give his final thoughts about, we heard interesting thing, it's about leadership, it's about security for human, it's about looking to certain things. So please, Mr. Signori, can you share last things that you would like to share with us?
Maybe two comments. The first one is let's say as a conclusion. The first one is that for us it's important to support policies at the national level which are transformational. So supporting national adaptation plans, national determined contribution, development plans, but also support, let's say, increase ambition, to push countries to increase ambition. And the second element I would like to mention is that in our Global Europe program, our program for the next 7 years, we have an increased budget for climate and environmental action to 30%. So it's quite important, let's say, ambition level for our cooperation. And for that, I mean, we plan to launch transformative programs at the national and regional level in line with what was discussed today. Thank you very much again, and happy to have been participated to this conversation. Over.
Thank you so much. And I think Mr. Sall would like to add something. Is that correct? Did I see you raise your hand, Monsieur Sall? Est-ce que je voyais que vous aviez encore quelque chose que vous aimeriez partager avec nous?
I saw you raise your hand. No, I did not raise my hand, but I fully agree with what has just been said and discussed. The major problem we're facing, and we were facing when we tried to simulate and test policies, is that each policy can correspond to different types of farms, and then there's differences between regions. And it's really difficult to define one single global policy. The government is trying to promote subsidies to inputs in order to promote production and encourage production, but this is a short-term solution. And what we have seen more and more is that poverty was endemic and limited to rural areas, but now it's coming to urban areas. And in the last few weeks, we had to face frustration resulting from the restrictions adopted following the health crisis. And this is showing that poverty is becoming widespread. And the question is to know whether we need to go on promoting subsidies for agriculture in rural areas, because indeed that's where you have people who are very numerous and who are vulnerable. Or should we find other solutions that would be more specific? Because now poverty is gaining ground in urban areas. So we need to strike a balance between rural areas and urban areas. It's very important for rural areas and urban areas to support one another. Sorry, because it's difficult.
So much indeed. So we have to be very careful if we talk about centralization or decentralization. We have to really see in what countries can we do that, because finding a global policy that works everywhere might also have a certain danger, is what I would like to wrap up with based upon what Mr. Sal was saying. And as promised, I'd like to give Mr. Gardin some final words, and then we will indeed wrap up this session.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to add that somehow what we saw in this session is that it is a very passionate area of research for the future that involves different fields. It's economics, it's also sociology, it's policy. I mean, we need a good connection with policymakers. We need a connection with natural sciences, because with issues about the climate change or resources, etc. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting multidisciplinary, and we need clearly more research on this, both case studies and more general, more global stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. And before I close, I'd like to remind all of you that you have just a link that has been shared in Slido, where you can download the research papers and policy briefs available from the EU AFD facility website. So you can find that link on Slido. And for now, I would really say thank you to all our speakers, because you have been very passionate talking about all those projects. It was really interesting, and it was great to have had you all with us, in case the people that are following us. And I also want to thank all of those people that followed us this morning. In case you might have some more questions for our speakers, feel free to contact AFD. We will try to get you in contact with our speakers and get a reply on your questions, of course. And moreover, I hope we can see you back today or in the next days, because there's much more on the agenda. So I hope we will see you back. Thank you so much. My name is Suyin Arts. I was really happy to be the moderator of this fantastic panel today, and I hope you have a great day in what is resting there for us. And maybe I'll see you back this afternoon. Bye-bye.